Welcome to Insights in Sound, where we talk to the people behind the scenes, behind the technology, and behind the music. People you may not know, but you should. And please check out getitInWriting.net/shows for a full list of our podcast YouTube series.
My guest is Paul Wolff. He is the proprietor and founder of Fix Audio. And if you haven't heard of Paul, when you start finding out information about him, you just keep peeling back the layers of the onion and you go, really, you did that too?
Yeah, that's the thing.
It really is. So let's do a little bit of just background on you, because you obviously have a musical background as well as the technical. And I'm always fascinated by the whole left brain, right brain thing of so many people who get into music also get into tech, but they get into it on different levels. And you're really like way over on the left. You know, just to clarify, Paul has designed consoles for many years.
I do see the horse walking backwards, though, which is supposedly
That's pretty scary. Yeah, that is. But your main gig for many years now has been designing consoles.
Yeah.
That's a really heavy-duty left brain thing, just to conceptualize signal flow and to understand gain structure like that on that granular basis is pretty heady, I think.
Yeah, if the question is, why would anyone want to do that?
Well, that is the question that I've always asked myself, and that's where I always used to get hung up between the creative and the technical, because I've lived in both worlds too. But the fact that you've got a musical background forces you to think about these things differently. We were talking earlier off camera about the idea that so many of the roots of pro audio are in telephony and defense and all of these really nerdy scientific disciplines. But you also come from a musical background, right?
Yeah, I mean, the defense part and that part of it, I think what that brings to the table is the discipline and the realization that there are certain things that just have to be.
The laws of physics.
Yeah, I mean, there are rules,
Yeah.
But then the music side of it says that you can go anywhere you want within those rules, and sometimes you can go outside of them. I say this a lot to people. I say the whole thing about, mixing inside the box, thinking outside the box, doing all this kind of stuff. When you create something that's outside the box, you tend to build a box around that because that's your comfort zone.
Yeah.
So what I try to do is I continually try to break those boxes and just keep expanding, And the testimony to that is the fact that, when I owned API, I built what API pretty much created. When I started Tonelux, I didn't want to be that. I wanted to be something else completely. Mm-hmm. So I recreated it with different features and stuff like that. When I started Fix Audio Designs, I did the same thing. I created something that wasn't the same as that.
Now, have you built a box around it yet?
And I haven't. No, and that's the thing. It's like I don't even know what a box is anymore. But that my parents, I grew up in a family that lived in Traverse City, Michigan, which was kind of an artistic sort of area. There was a lot of artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of people like that.
And your parents were artists as well, musicians?
My parents were both in big bands in the 40s.
Oh,
my
nice.
mom was
okay.
She was in the Victory Sweethearts, which was an all-girl big band. And if you look at Private Ryan in the movie, there's a scene in the USO Club where there's an all-girl band playing on the side. That was my mom's band. That's what that represented. So they would play, and they got picked up by the USO and CBS. And there's records, I have recordings of them, everything, which is really cool.
Well, the other thing about that's interesting is that era of recording was essentially a one mic era.
Yeah.
So you had to learn a lot about acoustics, mic placement, again, laws of physics.
And you had the what they called transcription records, which were the larger 16-inch records. I think.
Yeah.
They would send those to radio stations, and then they would all play them at the same time, so it seemed like a live broadcast, but it really wasn't.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of the clubs in those days, a lot of the nightclubs had rotating stages. Because they advertised continuous music.
So they'd be setting up one while the other is facing the audience.
The other band, there's two bands, and each band was was supposed to learn the other band's opening song, so they could transition.
Oh, okay.
That's how my parents met, because my dad was also in a big band. They both played saxophone, and pull the curtain back, there's my mom and there's my dad, and that's how they met. And they did this short tour of clubs at the, synchronized, and they got to know each other. And, and
Interesting.
The funny thing is I have this picture of my mom's band that shows the band leader and all the girls around it, and I never knew what it was. I always thought it was like a class, her high school class or college class or something like that. Because in those days, when a woman stopped working, for the war or working in those types of things, she became the housewife, primarily because the husband made enough money and the economy was such that one person could support a family. So
Sure.
the woman's work was to raise the children. The man's work was to make the money.
Homemaker.
Homemaker,
Yes.
yeah.
Mhm.
And she, I tell you, her job, my dad would come home and expect a sweet hello or something like that. And a lot of times it was like, you deal with the kids now. I'm going to go to the bathroom,
Mm-hmm.
But they had a really good balance. But I never knew that she was even in a big band for years until she started writing a book. And the name of the book is I Ran Away with an All-Girl Band. It's actually on Amazon. And I'm reading this book for the first time, realizing that my mom was like a rock star.
It's interesting the stuff we don't know about our parents,
Yeah, well, some things is probably better
some things
off.
we don't want to know, but still.
And my dad was in several different bands, and when he retired, he became a civil engineer, which started out in Denver, then to Detroit, then to Traverse City, and then
So was that the beginning of your exposure to technical?
Well, after I was born, he was into engineering. He was into race car driving. He actually got my mom to race.
All right.
He screwed
Your
that
mom
up.
was a badass. Okay.
He screwed that up by buying my mother a face shield for her anniversary one year.
Oops.
And one of her friends said, "Well, that's a marriage killer."
Tell you what, man, that's almost like getting a vacuum or something.
Yeah, but at least it wasn't a kitchen item.
Right. Mhm.
But he joined several big bands, local big bands. There was one that was a guy who found a bunch of oil on his property, funded a big band called the Reef Petroleum Big Band.
Oh, I love it.
And he was in that. And so I would go to sleep every night with my dad playing saxophone, practicing, which, those just having those notes instilled in your body.
Oh, sure. The
And
first
then, of
music
course,
you're exposed to is always...
Exactly. I mean, that's the thing. And then, of course, he raced cars, so he was into British cars. So we had, Berkeleys. We had, and there's one of them on my Facebook page. I post them occasionally, different ones. But there's Berkeley, TR2, TR3, TR4.
I
Austin
rebuilt
Healey
a
Sprite.
TR6 Plus.
Yeah.
So I understand. They're very tweaky.
They're tweaky
machines. Yeah.
and you had to play around with them. And as a kid, if you look at my Facebook page, there's me sitting in a Formula One car that was one of my dad's friends, and I'm sitting in this car, and I got this look of just total glee on my face. I was the guy when I was 13 in the pits that would fix the SU carburetors for the other drivers, because if you took the pistons out, they had a needle valve that was about this long. And they would take that piston, was the thing that was the accelerator pump. They would put brake fluid in there instead of oil, so it would snap out really quick. But in doing that, you had to pull it out and clean it, and then put the brake fluid in and put it back in, and they would bend the pins. So I'd sit there like this, and I'd turn it around, and I would straighten these pins out, which was in the manual, in the SU carburetor manual, basically said it was impossible to do.
Child fingers.
Right, and so I used to always put on the exhaust manifold bolts because my dad could never get his hand around there. And,
So you were exposed to a lot of technical stuff. Also at the same time as music.
Music.
And in a way it's kind of fascinating because they're, on the surface, they're unrelated disciplines.
Right.
But it obviously also exposed you to a lot about electronics because cars,
Well, especially the Lucas wiring things.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's a lot of things that teach you what not to do.
The wiring harnesses from hell.
Yeah.
Yes.
But-
So let's fast forward from that a little bit. When you started playing music, was it? I mean, obviously, you were exposed to their kind of music, but you're also of a certain age. You probably picked up
the
not the
Beatles.
saxophone, but the guitar, right?
The guitar, yeah. And I was a shitty guitar player. and I was a shitty bass player, but I did have a couple of bands. I actually have a picture of me playing in a band that played at one of the local teen clubs. I actually play drums a lot better than I play guitar, but I never really, I just wasn't serious about it. I didn't focus on it. My brother played guitar really well for a long time. He was an artist, as was my mother, so they paired up, and my dad and I paired up. He was a lot better. He had some bands. At that time there was the Beatles, which my introduction to the Beatles was my mom saying, "I really like that Ringo Starr guy. He's got great meter." And I thought to myself, "Oh, really?" And I go, "What the fuck is meter?" But that always stuck in my head. And through my whole recording career, I was in the studio. That was something that I was really strict about, because when she explained it to me, and my dad explained it to me, and they explained the feel, and they explained speeding up and slowing down, and why, back then there were no drum machines or anything like that, so there was no reference to the contrary. But they explained to me how a lot of times, getting ahead of the beat a little bit intensified a part of the song, and then laying back calmed the song down. So I'd listen to that, and Ringo does that. His meter is not a metronome.
Oh no, but the other aspect of that is kind of interesting is that I always kind of felt like the drums, the rhythmic aspect of music, is the bridge, because it's so mathematical.
Yeah.
Right. So there's your bridge really between the creative and the technical. Is if you start playing with that absolute metric of boom, 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 and as you say, you start getting ahead of it, you start getting behind it. Those are the little fascinating things that I think what you're calling, kind of pushing the laws of physics a little bit, getting outside that box a little bit. That's what a good drummer does.
And
that's what a great rhythm section does.
The guys, I would imagine that in the earlier days, having a steady meter was really important. And, metronomes with a microphone into the headphones. But then you had the drummers that pushed it a little bit, laid it back, pushed it and laid it back, and all of a sudden it was like, wow. Yeah. And that's outside of the box kind of thing, because you got bad meters when the guy is in a section is varying, or he goes into a roll, rushes into a roll, then comes out and then hits the beat. That's bad meter. But good meter is when you're driving the ship.
Yeah, exactly. You're pushing it a little bit here to give it a little bit edge. You're laying it back here to give it a groove, whatever it is. Yeah, and that that's the origins of hip hop. Right. Is laying it back and stuff like that. But
interestingly enough, I have a drummer, this guy Billy Traynor, that I had recorded for years over different bands and stuff like that. They actually had got signed by CBS and stuff. And one of the times that I recorded him, we recorded him really seriously. I recorded him with the Led Zeppelin miking technique, to get that bit nice sound. But I noticed at soloing the drums, I noticed that he hit his snare ahead of time and his kick behind time, and it just made it. It was just this and it was amazing how heavy it made it feel without varying.
That also probably opens up a really nice spot for the bass.
Yeah.
Which is another thing, I think the relationship between the two has always been really critical, especially to modern music,
Well, the kick drum is supposed to trigger the bass note.
Theoretically, yeah. Although that's been, again,
lost,
really played with, and for better and worse.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's fast forward a little bit. You obviously at some point were drawn more to studio. I think you had mentioned you worked in a studio in D.C. Was that your first studio?
I actually was doing live music. I enjoyed mixing. What it was is I was into electronics, and this is the story. Okay, I was into electronics, and I was hanging out at a local TV shop, which is the only place around that had anything to do with electronics.
Yeah.
And a guy walked in with a Stratocaster, and there was no sound. And so the guy had no idea, so I said, well, I know what that is. And I set it down, and I unscrewed the jack thing, and the jack had come loose, and it twisted around, broke the wires. Mm-hmm. So I soldered it back on again and screwed it back in really tight, and screwed it back in and plugged it into his little amplifier, and it worked. And I handed it back to him, and he goes, we'll call you Fix. And he left. And so about probably 8 months later, they came back into town as a band, and he contacted me, and I went to see him. So I built them a color organ, a light show that, the lights would blink to the different bands of the sound, and they had that set up. They had 3 bands. They had one guy that could play a saxophone, 3 saxophones at once.
All right.
Like, what was that guy?
Roland Kirk. Roland Kirk, yeah. Uh-huh.
And he could do that. And they had a keyboard player who ended up being the music director for, who's the guy that wrote the song about playing cards?
Kenny Rogers.
Kenny Rogers, yeah. He
uh-huh.
was his, and he does the country music thing. He always is the music director.
Mm-hmm.
He was a keyboard player, and I still stay in touch with him. So those guys, you know, that was a kind of a cool thing. So I met up with those guys, and I ended up going out with those guys on the road as their sound man. And I was kind of like the light man at first, because their sound man, they had a sound man. Mm-hmm. And I ran their spotlight and stuff, and they had a really cool show. And then he decided he didn't want to do that anymore, so he left, and I ran sound. And that was like, oh, by the way, he's not here anymore, you're running sound. And it was like, uh-oh, you know, and it was pretty bad for the first few times.
But it also probably solidified, I mean, you mentioned, you know, you were a shitty guitar player, a shitty bass player. There comes a point in people's career where they say, you know what, I want to be back here behind the console.
Yeah.
I want to be making.
Well, that's what I
sausage,
realized that I really
you know?
enjoyed mixing the stuff, you know, blending it.
I can understand that, yeah.
What do they call a balance engineer?
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, EMI. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, and that's basically what it is. And so I started doing that, and then I left that band and went onto another band that actually had a better console, and they had 4 vocalists. They had keyboards, guitar, bass, and so, you know, that was actually tough, and I got to be really good. I got well known. And then there was a point where I joined I actually had a stop at a nightclub. A guy hired me to be the sound man at this club in Niles, Michigan, called Shula's.
So now, give me an era here, because you just mentioned this band had a better console.
Oh, right. Well, so, okay, the first band had one of those acoustic boards that had like 6 inputs.
Uh-huh.
The club, the club that I worked at had a small mixer, I don't remember what it was, and a Shure Vocal Master, which the Vocal Master actually sounded, the output of the Vocal Master sounded really nice.
In those days, it was it. You know, it was pretty much it, yeah.
He wanted to spend the money, so we were right by Crown, and we were right by Electro Voice. So Electro Voice was coming out with their TL cabinets.
I remember those.
Yeah, they had not, and that was the guy, that Thiel, who came up with, there was always 2 formulas in making a speaker cabinet. You always had to tune it by hand. Mm-hmm. He figured out that first variable, so you could design it and it would be right. Mm-hmm. And so the TL cabinets were very efficient. So we had.
I still have one.
Really? Oh.
I have one with a 12-inch Gauss in it.
Yeah.
I used to have one with I think it was a 30-inch Gauss. It was really honking, because I had somebody build me, according to plans, one for my big, huge Gauss, and then the smaller one actually sat on top of it. That was my stage monitor. And I still have that 12-inch.
I never understood why those didn't catch on more. Because
sounds fantastic.
They were phenomenal. And
it sounds
loud,
fantastic, and
efficient.
I can set it up right next to me on stage, and I don't need any kind of monitors. It's great.
Well, we had the quad 12s, and then we had remember that big white horn they made?
Yeah.
All right, now the thing about that white horn that they really took a bath on was it was what they call a constant directivity horn, which meant that all the frequencies were dispersed. But that also meant that the high frequencies rolled off. Now the JBLs would narrow. So if you were staying in front of them, they always sounded even.
Yeah.
But if you stood off to the side, they were dull. With these, it was dull all the time, so you had to use a pre-emphasis curve. You had to build this little passive filter that went into the amplifier, and it would flatten them out. So we had the white horns in those, and then we bought the first Soundcraft 1604 that was in the metal box.
Oh, wow. Uh-huh.
We bought, and I actually have my first one. I still have it in the garage.
I love it.
That was the first, it was a discrete console, and that was Phil Dutteridge. And you know, Phil Dutteridge used to be the front of house guy for Led Zeppelin.
That's right.
And he started Soundcraft, I think,
yeah.
out of frustration, and then sold that and ended up buying Focusrite.
So for you, this whole idea of actually working on a console came through live.
Having to build the filter for that thing, because the guys at Electro Voice, and we used to go to Electro Voice. I've been in their anechoic chamber.
Yeah.
You know, and
they're right
Crown.
there
I went to Crown.
Yeah.
They supplied us the amps. Electro Voice gave us the sound system because they wanted to they wanted to do testing.
Uh-huh.
So we had the most amazing sound system there. Then a band came through that had horns, and it was like a Edgar Winter's White Trash band.
Uh-huh.
And I went on the road with them, and that brought me to D.C.
Now that also really complicates the mix in so many
Yeah.
ways, man. I mean,
Well, when I told my parents the first time the band wanted me to go on the road, I said to my parents, I want to go on the road with this band. I think I was like 20. This would be 1974, okay, to give you a reference. And most parents would go like, "You're out of your mind." Both of my parents said, "You're going to love it."
awesome. There you go. There you go. Uh-huh.
So I did. I went out with 6 months with those guys, 6 months with the next band. Then I was a year and a half at Shula's as the sound guy, and then I left Shula's and went with what was the name of those guys? They had 3 horns, keyboards, and everybody in the band was just top notch. The bass player played his bass on the other side, and it was a lot like Paul McCartney. Everybody could sing. That's where I met Steve Hatfield, the keyboard player, who was just the most amazing keyboard player on the face of the earth. And bass player he was amazing. I worked with him in several bands after that, just because it was just like he was just so good. But those guys, they played a lot of clubs. They played a lot of places that I played before. So I went on the road with them and ended up in D.C. and moved to D.C. And that's when I stayed for like 28 years.
And is that where you also transitioned from live to studio?
And that's when I transitioned from live. We played a club called the Bayou Nightclub in Georgetown, and that's where I left the band. I was working at a sound contractor place. We were designing sound systems for commercial installations, and I fucking hated it. And I just decided one day that I'm done. And I drove around the Beltway, and I drove into the Bayou, and I came into the Bayou, and I said to Mike Tremonti, the owner, I said, if you need a sound man, now's the time, because otherwise I'm heading back to Michigan. And he said, I would pay you just to stay in town. And he hired me. So I became the house sound man at the Bayou Nightclub. And at that time, that's when Pat Benatar was starting out, so I did sound for her. Foreigner, first time they ever played in front of humans, I did their sound at the Bayou. We got them for $1,800, and 3 nights later they were playing the Capitol Center. They had 3 songs in the top 10. I mean, it was amazing. Dire Straits, same thing.
Wow.
Molly Hatchet, 38 Special. All these bands were starting out in those days. Kiss, U2, all of them. They all played our club. And that was my job. I ran the sound, because a lot of them didn't even know what a sound man was. And we had a nice sound system, because they were willing to put the money into doing it. So we were part of that circle with the Bijou, the Bottom Line. I did the Ramones.
You were the hip circuit, basically.
Well, we did the Ramones. So we covered like Ramones to rock, and then CBGB's covered the Ramones to punk.
To punk, yeah.
So we had this little overlap. So we had a few of their guys, And I was there for 3 or 4 years. We did a lot of cool things, and then they were getting ready to sell the place. It had been open since the 50s. I'll actually give you one of the documentaries. It's really cool.
One thing that I want to interject is that I think there's a different learning experience to being in the same club every night with different artists, as opposed to being on the road with the same artist in different venues.
It's you have like 10 subgroups of things. When you're in the venue, the first 6 vary. When you're live, the second 6 vary.
Exactly.
But there's always
so
that,
you had that balance. You learned by being on the road with a bunch of bands, but then you planted yourself in a location and worked with the same system in the same room every day, which I think gives you a really kind of well-balanced.
I made a lot of those bands sound better than they thought they could sound, because that's when I started realizing that I really had a feel for hearing and mixing and what needed to work out. I hadn't been in the studio yet. My very, very first session that I ever did was by accident, almost by force. There was a studio in town called American Star, which was built in conjunction with the Sun Myung Moon Church.
Ooh, I love it.
They funded it. So, and this guy had it. So he was a pop guy. So he recorded He recorded a lot of bands, but he only did it at night because they didn't allow rock and roll in the band in the studio. But he did it at night, you know. So I get a phone call one day, and he said, you know, he goes, Fix, I need you to come here. I got a problem with the console. You know, I said, oh, okay. He says, yeah, and I feel really crappy. So I show up, and he says, okay, here's this, 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 and this, and this. I have to go. And he left. Now, keep in mind, I'd been in front of many consoles, but I'd never been in the studio before.
Well, and that's every person's trial by fire in the studio.
Oh,
you know?
yeah.
Here you go, gotta go.
Yeah,
you know?
and
that has happened to
left.
so many people that I've talked to, including myself, you know, where you get this call, all of a sudden, it's not that you get to start by watching somebody or learning it. No, it's like, here you go, hold this.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Don't screw this up.
Yep.
And so I go in there, and I mean, I was just like overwhelmed. I saw everything was taped on the console and everything like that. I look behind me, there's a bunch of people behind me. I hadn't looked through the window yet, okay? So I'm just going like, okay, I'm trying to figure this out. This was in the middle of a session. I mean, literally, they were a third of the way into the session.
Wow.
And he had to leave. And so, and he was sick. He really was sick. So it was an MCI console, had the API faders, and then there was the one with the red knobs. I don't remember, the 600 series or whatever that was. Nice sounding console. MCI machines, MCI locator. And so
Did it work?
It did. Everything worked. Yeah, everything worked.
MCI locator, you had to ask.
In those days, it worked as good as anybody knew that they could because it was the first one.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So the producer immediately recognized that I was kind of like, you know, thrown into a
little
pool.
over your head. Yeah.
So he said, well, let's start from the top. And I looked at the auto locator like I'm looking at a box of like, you know, parts.
Yeah.
And I looked at it like, you know, and I kind of had this look on my face. And he said, he just leaned over and he said, look, I'll run the locator for you. You just run the console. So the guy turned it around. He basically saved my ass at that moment.
He
Saved the
became your
session.
tape op.
He did. He saved the session, saved my ass. He took the thing over, set it all up, and he said, okay, we're going to record this on these tracks. And I looked down and I'd see what the tracks were assigned and everything like that. So I was running it. So then, as I'm doing that, and finally we're in record, I look up. And I look out there, and there's a full orchestra, there's a choir, there's singers, there's like instruments. They're all mic'd up with gobos and in booths and all this kind of shit. And it was an Avon commercial.
And they're all being paid scale.
They're all being paid scale, and they're all being paid not to waste time. And then behind me was the client, the director, the producer, the writer,
The marketing people.
and everything like that. And at that moment, I basically blacked out. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember how long I was there. I don't remember anything about the rest of the day. I have literally, I remember doing this and going, holy shit. And then it was like,
The adrenaline took over.
it did. And I remember I asked him the next day, I said, how'd it go? He says, it went really well. And I thought, yeah, I didn't even learn anything because I was blacked out. I couldn't remember anything that I'd done.
Well, but you had certain experience, that you brought with you, obviously.
So I did what I knew how to do.
Yeah.
And he recognized that, the producer guy. I never got a chance to thank him. I wish I could meet up with him now because it would be like, dude, you saved my ass. That was my first taste. That didn't like convince me I wanted to be in the studio. I thought, okay, well, I fixed something, and then I went back to the Bayou and did live sound. And then there was a point where the club was winding down, and I went to a seminar. No, I met the guys at the studio. I went down to the studio, and it really looked like fun. And they had an APSI console, APSI, which was very few of those.
Yeah.
It had.
It's right up there with Flickinger's.
Yeah, 3 550 EQs in the rack. They had a Stevens tape machine.
Oh my God!
A 24 and a 4-track, and we had a plate. We had a room that was really nice. The guy had built it. All this guy Nick Kamutsius. I'm still friends with him now. And we went there, and I worked there for a few years. I did a band called The Boys. I did all kinds of local bands. I mean, I was the heavy metal guy and the gospel guy.
Interesting combination.
I love both. I love doing both.
Mm-hmm.
And we, so I recorded all that kind of stuff. And then at that point, we had a seminar. The Synclavier had just come out. So we had a seminar there.
So this would have been like late 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had a seminar. We had a seminar for the Synclavier. We actually had it. We were an Aphex dealer too, so we actually had an Aphex 602B, the blackface one.
All right. You actually had one. You didn't rent it.
Yeah, we had one because we were a dealer. So,
right.
and I got to know those guys really well. That's where I met Marvin.
Marvin
Seaver.
Was quite the character, still is.
He
I'm
is,
sure,
and
yeah.
that's a key moment in the next part of the story after API. But then, so I was interested. The studio was actually going to be sold to somebody an investor who wanted to buy it out, and I was kind of getting bored with it because every band that I recorded would go up to New York and get a deal, but I wouldn't go with them, and I got frustrated. The band called The Boys. We were offered a deal. Ronnie Dio loved the band, and Susan Davis, who's now Susan Mancini, was married to Richie Blackmore at the time. She brought him to one of the gigs, and he took us to Warner Brothers and said, "You need to sign them." And they were ready to sign us with our tapes without re-recording them, because in those days they re-recorded everything. They were ready to. We were like a band, including the sound man. And they were ready to take the whole package. And our manager screwed it up and never told us. I didn't find out about this until the 90s.
Wow.
That he screwed it up.
Uh-huh.
One of our songs was Dear Prudence, an electric metal version. It's amazing, okay? So he spent 1.5 years, and he finally got another deal with Electra Asylum. And so he's flying out to L.A. I'm driving around with the singer. We're like nervous as hell because it's, but it was December 9th. Warm outside. We're driving around with the top down. Driving around. Yeah, now you get where this is headed. Driving around with the top down. And Beatle music is playing on all the radios everywhere. And the car, we're driving with, I had an MGB or an MG Midget, top down, Beatles playing, driving around, 75 degrees out in December. We pull up to a 7-Eleven so he could get cigarettes, and there's a guy under a payphone, and he's crying. And we walked up to him, we said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Somebody just shot John Lennon." And that's when we figured out why all the Beatle music was playing.
And that's also when you figured out that your single was not going
That was
to...
it.
Yeah.
That was the end of the band.
Yeah, timing is everything, as they say.
So that's when I went there, they said, "Hey, there's a company." One of the guys came there, used to work for Todd Rundgren, and he said, "By the way, there's a company out in Reston, Virginia that just acquired API, and they need people to go out there." So,
now, I don't want to get too deep down this rabbit hole, but there was a tie-in between Sunset Sound, API, this company in Reston, all of that stuff, that I know. What I found interesting about that in listening to the Sunset Sound podcast was that, there were certain studios that were really, they were leading the way in actually creating the whole concept of a console.
Yeah.
There was Trident, of course, in the UK, and Sunset Sound, I think, were more or less responsible for API becoming a console company. Is that fair to say?
API was, the guys that ran API, a lot of those guys came from defense contracting, industrial stuff, computers, stuff like that. They knew, I tell the story like, a theater says, because automated process originally did automated stage curtain things, so they could drop sets on cue and stuff. And you could picture that situation. Say, well, you guys are in electronics. We need a nice sound system here. Could you make a mic pre? So they would, and then well, we need to equalize it. So they made an EQ. Well, we need to put it all together. So they put it in the console. That's kind of how this stuff was born. That's sort of a transition. So API had started making consoles, but they were custom. Everybody had their own idea what it was.
Right.
Sunset had their idea because some of the earlier consoles were, one-on-one, hand-built. This is what we need.
Exactly. Which was the evolution of the console to begin with.
That's what Rupert Neve started out doing the same thing, building custom things.
Neve, Trident, even SSL to a certain extent, I think. Although they came after the console. They were more, they were more big picture. We want to make a console, but a lot of these companies, as you say, they were essentially migrating from the concept of a broadcast console to here's what we need to do to make it in the studio for multi-track recording, which was also just beginning.
That's actually the beginning of stereo. Stereo was born in the United States, but in Europe, they wanted to get in on it quickly. And all the consoles they had in studios were basically mono consoles. You had an audition bus and you had a program bus. Well, EMI, they went to all their clients and they said, look, stereo is busting loose in the United States. We need to get in on this. We need to remix this stuff. So the only thing they could do is do left channel, right channel, and that's why drums are on the left, instruments on the right. And I actually asked George Martin one time. I said, I have a question, a really obscure question about tambourines, and he was like, okay. And I said, so when you put tambourines on with the Beatles, I said, was it because you liked a tambourine, or was it because it balanced the drums? He said, well, in a lot of cases, it's the only thing that would balance the drums out.
It's interesting, because one of the things that I had heard from Jeff Emmerich was the idea that part of the reason the tambourine was so prominent was because after 3 or 4 bounces,
it would dull.
It would dull, and so they'd lay it on in a certain order because they knew, if we lay the bass in, it's going to die by the time we get to the third overdub, or the third transfer rather.
If you're transferring, if you're doing sound on sound,
yeah,
and that's true. That's the thing. So there were the brighter stuff was recorded. Some of the brighter stuff was recorded first, some of it was recorded last, some of it was recorded again to brighten it up. But when they started separating it into stereo, they needed a balance, and so the tambourine accented the snare.
Yeah.
So he said there was a lot of reasons we use it, but that was one of the reasons. So that's how that part of it started out. Then some guy figured out the pan pot, and that was the beginning of stereo stuff. And then all of a sudden, then you needed equalization. And you remember those early consoles, maybe 4 channels had EQ, and the rest didn't.
And it was all passive EQ.
Right, and there were bass treble, or maybe they're just roll-offs, or cuts only, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think it started to progress. It's almost like the whole Pultec thing, where a guy comes up to the guy, and says, we need an EQ to boost the highs and cut the lows on a broadcast feed because there's a lot of hum. So he makes this version. Then the guy says, well, it'd be nice if we could have that, but we could boost the middle. Then it was the -1 version. And then it was, so all these little -1, the EQP4-1, and all these different ones had mods that these guys did.
Well, and that goes back to your original statement about, you're staying within the laws of physics to a certain extent, but you're trying to bend them a little bit. You're trying to get outside that box. And that really does, as you say, we try something to go outside the box, and then we create another box, you know. And that box, in that sense, was the console.
The console was the box, and in the early days, everybody was, when they were custom, everybody was evolving these consoles. But what was happening was, I think a lot of these, a lot of the manufacturers were realizing they couldn't make any money because everything was custom. So they had to start standardizing. So, who invented the modular console? Was it Neve or was it API? Who knows? They kind of did it. It was one of those things that just happens, And it's like a lot of innovation is when you talk about the laws of physics, you're talking about why did someone need a mid-range boost to begin with? Well, the broadcast feed sounded so shitty, they needed to boost it. So now there's the invention of the mid-range thing. Now someone starts focusing on that and refining it. The low-end stuff, was it to cut hum? And so now it's like, well, what if we just notch the hum and then boost the low end? So every problem creates a solution, and then those solutions get expanded and become a feature. Echo sends. There was a plate reverb and there was a tape echo. When the harmonizer came out, it just blew everything up because now you had digital delay. The original harmonizer was a rack mount module. That was, and they came up with that by just reading it faster than they were writing it, and it changed the pitch, and it was like, oh my God, we just invented something, So those are, those types of things. That's what one leads to the next, and a lot of those are mistakes. The Aphex was a mistake. The harmonizer.
There are so many things that really were just happy accidents.
Bias was a mistake.
Yeah.
That was they used to have DC erase heads, and it would.
And Richard Factor talks about how the harmonizer was a complete accident in a way.
You were reading it at a different rate. You were writing it because the clocks weren't the same, and all of a sudden the pitch is off, and you go, wait a second, why is it doing that? Because if the clocks were the same, it would read the same.
Yeah.
That's what innovation is recognizing. Now you have this solution, but now the solution expands and you have a window, a range, and you try to, go to the edges of that. And that's where, all the digital stuff, all this stuff is because someone's pushing the limits of technology and going beyond, well, what if we did this? What if we sped the clock up? What if we did a higher sample rate? What if we, what if we went from 16 2/3 to 33 1/3? What if we went to 45?
Well, and pushing the boundaries like that whole what if question is always, that is what creates these new
And that's
innovations.
what innovation is. And
yeah.
that's where a good...
Nice segue here. Nice segue. I like that.
Yeah, see, ba-dum-bum. I mean, this is what happens, doing live. Like, I go out with Jim Messina a lot because I love his band. We're best friends. He's a phenomenal musician. He plays quiet on stage. I love mixing those guys live. But we did a gig where, nothing worked. So he was working with the monitor guy, who, by the way, was deaf.
That's a
And
feature.
The lady next to me, she came in early. She sat down. She says, "Why is that singer yelling at the sound man?" I said, "Because he's deaf." And she says, "Aren't sound men supposed to hear?" And I went, But the front of house console wasn't working. So what happens is you immediately go into that repair mode. Now, that's where a lot of people stop because they don't know. And I did. So I was looking at, because I'd get 1 through 16, 17 through 32 wasn't working. Then 33 through 48 was, the digital interface. So I fiddled around with routing and doing stuff like that. It wasn't working right, so I just took the XLRs and put them in the lower channel and just did bank here and bank here. And that's what we did to start the show. And that's where, the troubleshooting and stuff, where I'm really good at, is because I can see the problem. I'll give it a minute. I'll try to fix it. If it doesn't fix it, then I patch it and move on with the show.
Well, you remove variables by doing that. That's
Right.
that's a classic testing methodology. Is if this doesn't work, what are the facets of this that I can change to see what works?
Right.
Where's my signal flow going to change?
And if that doesn't work, then you bypass it. You shit can it. And you
Yep.
got to know, you got to remember to start from the beginning, because it could very simply be a power cord.
Yep. Yep.
The biggest problem in troubleshooting is people assuming that it's not something that they know it isn't.
I did this with my students last semester. I gave them a problem, and I knew that this would totally flummox them, but I did it intentionally. I brought in a base that had active electronics, and I knew that I needed to change the 9-volt. And I hadn't changed it yet, and I said, okay, so let's track down the signal flow. And I plugged in the base, and they went all the way through the whole thing, and they were getting really frustrated because, it was not something they would have looked. I finally did reveal to them. I said, okay, no, it's not over here. It's not over here. It's way over here at the source, because they hadn't come back to the base. And I said, and what I did to finally illustrate it to them was I said, has anybody thought about trying a different guitar?
Yeah.
Ooh, but that's the kind of thing that you're talking about, is really troubleshooting stage by stage by stage. And yeah, they started at the other end. Had they started at the source.
Well, that's where doing the live stuff comes in.
Yeah,
because you
yeah.
have one opportunity. You're setting up the band, and it's like we set it up with acoustic guitar. Okay, I'm not getting the acoustic guitar. The first thing, and the guy Tim Creek is Jimmy's guitar guy. He's like I am. He's an absolute troubleshooter. He goes right down to it and starts. So the first thing he does, I don't even say it to him. The first thing he does is goes over and gets the other guitar, just in case.
Yeah.
You got to do elimination. And there's a point where if that's not working and that's not working, then the DI, then you bypass the DI. You get another DI. But you don't fart around with every little noodly thing, because you don't have time. So you know what? If the new DI works, that's what we're using.
Yep.
We're done.
Yep. Exactly.
And
Get the
that's
show
where,
on.
in the studio, applying that now to the studio now, you get a guy who is in the studio, you got a client in there, they're being paid by the hour. I learned at a very early stage, you don't want to be the groove buster.
Yeah.
Okay, and the groove buster is the guy who noodles and noodles and noodles and noodles until the band has just lost their mojo.
Yep.
When something goes wrong, you got about 8 seconds. So we had a console one time. We were doing, it was a famous singer. She was really good. She was ready to go, and this was going to be a good take. The mic pre was popping, sputtering. Okay, the first thing I did is just went patched into another one, set it for the same thing, and hit the phantom power, and we went. Okay, and the guy afterwards, he said, "Man, I would have noodled around with that for 10 minutes trying to figure out why it was bad." I said, "I don't care why it's bad.
Yeah.
I popped in a new one because I knew that sound was coming from the mic pre." And that's another thing, is as you catalog these experiences, and this is another thing that I do a lot of stuff at Blackbird. I go up there and I talk about filters, I talk about this and that and the other. At the end, Mark Rubel always says, So what's the biggest piece of advice you can give my students? And I look at them and I go, pay attention.
Yes. Yes.
Because every single thing that happens in that studio, you can log. The next time it happens, you'll know exactly what to do.
Yes.
And if you're paying attention, you'll remember it. If you're not paying attention, it'll go right past you.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. And sometimes you do need to learn a lesson twice.
You do. Yeah, there's times, and that teaches you to pay attention. It's like, somebody says, do you want a drink? I say, yeah, anything that has a cap. Because I'm not going to be the guy that spills the drink on the console.
Yeah.
You know, and it always sits on the floor. And I see other people with an open cup of something standing right over the console, and I'm going, you need to stand over there.
Oh, I had the owner of one particular studio used to have a habit of placing his coffee cup right on the faders with hot coffee in it. And every tech who was in the room would just cringe. Yeah.
And he would never spill it because he knew better, but he also knew better than to do that. But he knew better than the better, so he did the other.
Yeah, well, it was D-Rob.
Yeah.
And D was one of those guys who knew exactly what he was doing.
Yeah.
Brilliant man. You know?
So he would, but the problem with that is that, you know, and God, I miss that guy. Mm-hmm. He was just so colorful.
No, he was brilliant and funny as all hell.
He was
Absolutely.
funny and just positive. But the thing about the problem with doing that is that that other guy sees it and then thinks
it's
I
okay.
can do that.
Yeah.
And see, D was the kind of guy that he owned the console, so he knew if he spilled it, he's screwed.
Yep.
So he would pay attention.
Yes.
But the other guy would set it somewhere, especially with moving faders nowadays. You know, set it somewhere. Yeah. And spill it, and he would never do that.
Yep.
So those are the things. A lot of times you can't do what you normally do in a studio, because you don't want other people to see you doing that.
Yes, exactly.
You know? But I mean, those are the other thing is when I go into studio, the first thing I would look at, like when I was making products, like when I made the first Tonelux stuff, I put the tilt control on the mic pre. So I would go into a studio and I would look and I'd look at their equipment and I'd see where they sit, where all the knobs sit. Because that's how they're going to use them. Mm-hmm. And I learned that with API. When I came out with the whole 200 series stuff, the way that I set it up was, and I would even slug a pot with a resistor just to move the position of it. If you put, like on the gate, if you put all the knobs straight up and down, it was like 3-to-1 for expansion. It was like 3-to-1 or 2-to-1, I think. It was 2-to-1. The release time was musical. The attack was right around 0. It wasn't +4, it was around 0. So it came in, and then you could just turn it back a little bit. With the compressor, it was set up a 3-to-1 compression, a good release time, and the threshold was just enough to where it just got into compression.
But you do that intentionally because that gives somebody a visual reference as well.
Because the guy in the studio, if you notice, the guys in the studios will always just set the knobs in the middle, and then they got to get back to the session. They can't jerk around with that while the guy's singing. Mm-hmm. If you give them a good sound right off the bat, that they can just put everything in the middle and it sounds okay, that might be okay enough. But they might also look at the ratio and they say, oh, I want a little more or a little less. And all you got to do is tweak one knob and they're there.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I learned. So when I would go in the studio and I'd look, and I would notice that all the tilt controls on the mic pre's were always set at 1 o'clock. So it just did a little bit of a lift of the high end, a little cut of the bottom, and that was it. And it made the piano clear, the acoustic guitar clear, the vocals clear, all the way down the line. It made everything just a little clearer, you know. And those are the things that you learn. And so when you have those problems in the future, and those are things that never go away.
Yes.
And that's what when we were originally talking earlier about how do we apply this to kids that aren't necessarily involved in consoles, that don't even know what a console does or the value of it. Those types of things are universal. They're part of the laws of physics. Observing what it is, there are certain things that just are. Microphones sound a little better when they're slightly brighter, and a little low end is cut out. A lot of things sound better, and the mids are always cut out. You just start out with a little bit cut out. You can always add it back, but you might be there. More times than not, you're going to be there if you do that. You set your fader at like -6. Don't set it at 0. Set it at -6. So if it's a little loud, you know what to do. Those little rules are always there. And that's where a lot of problems, I think probably the biggest problem with the DAW world is that these idiots could never realize that coming up with the same VU meter level setup, instead of 0 being the point where everything stops, 0 being the reference point, and then having plus above that. That created, because there were no references at that point. Was it plus 18? Is it plus 12? Is it plus 13? Is it plus 14? What is it? Because what is really 0? I look at a view meter and it's reading 0, but the meter's down here and 0's up there. If they had done that, I even think the loudness wars would be different.
Well, and gain structure in general is part of...
It's a huge problem.
It's a huge problem. More to the point, though, in terms of the DAW world, because I'm glad you brought that up. In the DAW world, if you've grown up in that world, do you understand, do you grok the functionality of a tactile surface? Because you and I came up in an era where the tactile surface was not just a luxury, it was part of the process.
Right.
And now, I mean, I was part of the team that worked on the first control surfaces. And for me, that was something that was always essential because I like playing the faders. Is there an understanding of what those faders do? Is there an understanding of why those faders are important to a DAW generation?
I think, what I've found is the guys that were brought up in the DAW era record better on a DAW than the guys brought up in the console area.
Makes sense.
Because of the fact that they're already aware of that stuff, not in comparison, but that's how they started out. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest thing, and this is one of the reasons why I'm such a proponent of the Slate Raven, is because what the biggest difference is having a knob per function and being able to grab two things and compare them or adjust them together.
Yes.
Balancing guitars. With a mouse, you have to move one up and then one down, one up and then one down.
Or just playing with, playing with faders, mid-side miking, things like that,
right.
Where you can grab two faders and do this and that.
Move like that.
Yeah.
And that's where the Raven really gave a lot of people the ability to do that. Plus the plug-in, when the plug-in comes up on the screen, it's the actual plug-in. Most of them are almost real size, and you push the knob up and down. So it more of a connection to how things normally work, although you're not moving something physical.
It is a great visual bridge, though, you're right, between the DAW and the analog world.
Because mapping knobs to a plug-in, you're still turning the knob over there and looking over here, which is not...
And that is, that whether you're using an old MCU or a Huey or one of the Avid controllers or whatever, you're right. You have to map that. And even if it's mapped, there's never, well, maybe there is if you live in one studio and you have one control surface for years and years.
Right.
But there's never really this point, or at least there hasn't been for me, where it's so intuitive that I go, okay, I'm going to tweak my reverb, boink, boink, and I know that this knob is doing this, and I can just look at that.
Every console's different. That's the problem.
Yeah, exactly.
The old consoles, if you looked at any of a Neve, API, MCI, Sound Workshop, any of those consoles, they had a fader, they had a panner, they had a mute button, they had sends.
I got aux sends, and exactly.
And they all did the same thing. With when I do Jimmy, we go. Thank God for these guys coming up with the offline editors, because I'll go in and lay out the entire console, labeling. I know all my EQ settings. I know all my compressor settings, and I'll set them all up ahead of time. So I load the file, and it's all there. So all I have to do is tweak it, okay? But the problem is I would love to be able to use my doubler plugin, the Softtube one. I'd love to be able to use that on these gigs. But every console has a different way they do the mapping. So I wouldn't have any idea of how to even map it in the time that I'm doing a sound check and panic ensues.
Sure, of course.
So that's what happens is a lot of times that stuff isn't even used. Because I know the Avid console, you can use plugins on all over the place. But you have to map them.
Yeah, well, and I always joke around with a lot of my synth friends because synth players in general tend to be very tweaky, and especially like Logic guys, right? They will map everything to an environment, to this, to that, and if they've got a certain controller, they know exactly what in this mode that knob will do.
Right.
And that's great for you in your natural environment.
Yeah, that's your console in your studio.
Exactly.
That's perfect.
Exactly. But if you're an engineer who's going to a dozen different studios, you're not going to know that. Right. You're not going to have the advantage of that.
You don't have time to learn it.
Exactly. So you're going to end up tweaking it with a mouse.
Yeah. So that's where I think the Raven really helps, is because that brings a standardization. Because
Yeah.
any studio that has a Raven, that plug-in's going to look exactly the same.
The only thing that bugs me is that I don't get my fingers on faders then.
Well, that bugs people, but the reality of it is you can move 8 faders at a time.
Yes, you can.
It's like, okay, and the other thing that's very cool about it is you can, if you're tracking, you can go into the high res mode on the fader, where the fader's travel is the entire screen. Once you touch that knob, you can look at the artist, and it doesn't matter if your finger drifts to the right or the left. As long as it stays touched to that knob, you can move it over here, and it still goes up and down.
Sure.
That is a plus.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the Raven's implementation in general, I would say, is as close to really a bridge between DAW and analog as we've gotten. I definitely got to credit you guys for that.
And I mean, then you have the fader controllers, which I think come next, which gives you the faders, and a panner and a mute and solo, which is like the basic Huey implementation. Those are fine because it gives you, because realistically 90% of what you have to do is balance between faders. But if you're doing 2 guitars, you're constantly doing this. When I do Jimmy live, I got one hand on 4 vocalists.
Absolutely.
And the rest is mixing the entire band, and I'm balancing those guys with one hand. That would be impossible to do live on one of these pinball machines, And some of these consoles that are really limited, where they only have 16 faders, and you got a bank, between them.
Oh.
We have things where there's a sax, a guitar, and a keyboard, and they're all 3 playing a 3-part harmony with the guys singing.
Yeah.
So I have to have one hand on the vocals. A lot of times I'll assign those 3 instruments to subgroups just so I can do them at the same time because they're on different banks.
Well, and that is the reason why digital consoles had such a difficult time in terms of being adopted early on, because you had those Yamaha consoles where you had to go 3 layers into a menu to find one function.
Right.
That's not going to work live.
No.
And it's barely going to work in the studio.
Like, the Midas console, the little Midas thing, it sounds really good, but their biggest mistake was they have 3 knobs for the EQ, and you got to pick what band it is. That drives me crazy because I'm lowering the lows when I'm raising the highs. Now you go to like the PreSonus, they've got all those things at once. So you go to the Yamaha, like the Profile, which is now discontinued, but they had their EQ here, their noise gate here, your compressor here, your routing here, your sends here. So if you hit the button, everything was there and you could do it. You're talking about speed. You're talking about efficiency.
Yes. And
noodling,
intuitiveness.
Right. Noodling is not in the books for me.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's where your experience, both live and in the studio, comes into play in terms of the design concepts that you're doing. And
well, that's the other thing, is knowing when to not put a feature in.
Feature creep.
Feature creep. And that's one of the things I've always done in my consoles. One of the things that Dan Zimmelman, when he used to work for me, the greatest line ever was, he said, never say no to a customer, but he said, be truthful. So if the guy, because the original Legacy had 6 sends, and the guy says, oh yeah, I really need 8. Dan said, well, we can do 8. It would be about $100,000 to redesign that thing to do that. And you do that, you place a value on it, then all of a sudden they go, well, you know what, I can do 6.
I could learn to live with 6, yeah.
But then you've got other companies that panic, and they go, oh, well, we can do that, and then they redesign it, and they add those extra pots, and now everybody uses 6 but that one guy, and they're basically had to raise the price of the console to satisfy one person.
Or they've layered it out where you have 2 of them, and all of a sudden you think you're on 4 and you're on 12.
Yeah, the layering thing. Now, like the Yamaha console, they got I think 12 or 14 knobs for the first bank, and then the second bank they got the same knobs for the second bank. So you can do sends of 12 things before you have to change banks.
Yeah.
You have the whole EQ there, plus the filter. Then they have a knob that you can assign to a function that you commonly use. And those things. And the brilliant thing about those guys is they have 3 or 4 different models of the same type of console. They have a simple one and one that's got more features. They all use the same file format, and they all, if one console doesn't have a feature that the other one does, it still loads that into memory. And when you save the file, it puts that back with the file.
Right.
It doesn't just throw it away.
Yeah.
So that's really brilliant, those types of things. And I mean, that's, you know, the file management thing, the offline editing thing makes the live stuff tolerable.
That is, I think, really a big part of why the adaptation finally happened. You know, I mean, that was one of the big things with the first Avid consoles, live consoles. You know, they're just, I think, being able to bring the expertise of people who have sat in that chair, you know, because far too many times you've got engineers designing stuff who really, they have the conceptual understanding, but they don't have the experience of actually being there and using it.
Well, now that is where, I don't want to put myself in the category of Rupert Neve because I think he like completely overshadows me. But one of the things that Saul Walker and Rupert Neve and all these people had in common with what I do is they knew how to operate the stuff, they knew how to hear the stuff, and they knew how to design the stuff.
Yeah.
And there's 4 aspects to it. There's operation of it, understanding the operation, understanding the sound of it, how does it sound, understanding the features, and the fourth one, which a lot of people mistake, and this is where the feature creep is the manufacturability of it. So I get all 4 of those things. When I design something, I'm thinking about, okay, I know what I would do in that situation. I talk to a handful of people like Ronald Prent, who is a guy who will say, well, this feature would be great, but not a lot of people would use it, so if it's expensive to put in, don't put it in. But you get other guys that say, oh, I have to have that, or it's unacceptable to me. You know, so you have those 2 guys. The problem is a lot of these companies rely on the wrong people, and they make a console that's perfect for that guy and is bullshit for everybody else. And I'm the guy who always is able to say, I'm not going to do that. It's not worth it, you know.
So, challenges of designing a console for today, because you're now deep into immersive.
Yeah.
And we don't even have to open that can of worms because there's so much in there that I don't want to dig up right now.
There's a lot of worms in the can.
Otherwise, we'll be here for 3 hours.
There's a lot of worms in the can.
And some of them are really ugly,
We'll be here
too.
12 times longer, 6 times longer than stereo.
Exactly. Yeah. But obviously, immersive is a thing. It's a reality, you know.
Yep.
And there are challenges involved here well beyond the idea of, oh, should we put a joystick in or whatever it is. You know, there are so many layers of challenges there. How do you address that and still keep in mind that usability and manufacturability concept that you're just talking about?
Well, you got to remember that with both Atmos and with Sony 360, both of those have way more speakers than are actually used. So what you have to do is you have to go, in a situation like this, you have to go to the end user. Okay, the end user, the only reason any of these formats are succeeding is because of binaural stuff in your ears. Because if it had to do with speakers, they would die just like surround did.
Sure.
Because nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to put the money in.
Yeah.
You know, so you start out with that point, and then you say, okay, that's all going to go down to that. Now let's move back one step. What are the customers that are the distributors, the providers? What are they doing? Okay, and so with my work with Ronald Prent, we figured out that every one of those people only wanted 7.1 plus 4. They didn't want 9.1.
Interesting.
They didn't want 6. Netflix, they fold it down to 7.14. And this has to do with bandwidth, and it has to do with being able to put it into a feed. It also has to do with overcomplicating. In binaural, you can't tell the difference between 2 side speakers and 1 side speaker.
Of course.
Or 6 speakers or 4 speakers.
But what about, for example, a lot of the earcam stuff, for example, they use, these are like immersive designers who are doing museum exhibitions and stuff like that. And they're doing, 30, 40 speakers.
That's, what you have to realize is there's 3 if you include that, but there's basically 3 things. You have movies, which those can be, the beauty of the Atmos system is the fact that it can be in 12 speakers or 24 speakers.
Sure.
It's the same file.
Sure.
So for the arrow to go across the room, you want to distribute that between as many speakers as you have, and it has to travel. That's fine.
And it has to, as you say, fold out or in. It has to expand or contract.
It has to expand or contract according to your theater. The live art performance things that you're talking about fall into that same category. They may want to have something go across slowly like this. And having something that's got a wide distribution, a phantom center doesn't always work. So they need 4 speakers. So
Yeah, yeah.
they'll need 28 speakers or something like that. So those are categorized together. Those are the movie things. The music stuff is totally different. And I know Atmos wants the Dolby people want people to use the same file. I think that's kind of a roadblock. I think they really need to be different because they went from tracks to speakers to headphones.
Yeah.
And you need to go from tracks to headphones. And that's part of the problem with their system is all that phase positioning information being brought down into 2 channels.
Being brought down into binaural.
Binaural,
yeah,
that's what I mean.
Exactly.
And so that, that's part of the thing is that it really is 2 different things. But what we found is that every single person that is supplying content doesn't want any more than 714. It always gets mixed down to that. Netflix, Sony Music, I mean their broadcasts, even the movie places that are using music and soundtracks, they don't want any more than that. They just bring the music in. The music's not flying around the room. So they just need the ambience in the ceiling, they need a good bed. They want 714.
Well, obviously there's a beauty to the idea of having a standard.
Well,
I mean, especially when you talk about movie theater chains.
It's becoming a standard, but a lot of the push for studios is to have like a 916 system, which is fine. Ronald has one, Greg Wells has one. They've got 916 systems. My console is set up to do 714, but it has 8 cents, so you can do extras if you want. But it's designed for 714 because that's what it ends up as. And if you take that and put that into binaural, it sounds a lot better than if you're taking 256 channels and putting it into binaural because it just gets too involved. So there's, I wish that someone would just say, for music, this is what we want. Because it would just make everybody's lives easier because everybody's trying to accommodate maybe more or maybe less. And I just decided.
Somebody has to. Somebody has to. Well, there's that old joke about, the nice thing about standards is that we have so many of them, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think at a certain point, it comes down to beta versus VHS or whatever it is. You have to make a decision. You have to get on a certain train because if you want mass adaptation,
you need to have simple.
Yeah, you need
quick.
to make it easy for people. They can't go into a store or go on Amazon and say, well, which one do I want? Nobody's going to want to do that research. Right. They just want to know, okay, what do I buy?
Well, you look at it like a sound bar. I have the Sennheiser sound bar downstairs, which is just completely amazing. And that is, I think their pro version is going to be a 16-channel one. So it'll only do 16 inputs, a different positioning. So they may have 9 and they may have 6.
But the fact is, it's all coming from a single source.
It's coming from a source.
And that, I think, I got the first demo of binaural, had to have been in the 90s at an AES show. They brought you into a room, you put headphones on, and all of a sudden, somebody is shaking a box of paper clips around your head. You remember that?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking at the time, man, if they can get this to actually come out of speakers so that you're not tethered to headphones, take my money.
Right.
That's the day it's really going to be.
But then what happens is the spouse steps in and says, you're not putting speakers up in the ceiling.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
And then Bose came in and made little teeny ones, and they said, okay, but no bigger than those.
Right, and then they made them Bluetooth so you didn't have to run wires.
Right.
But my point being, if you can get that at a 2 or even a sound bar, that's when you're going to get the acceptance, the mass acceptance, because that's when people don't have to go out and buy a surround system.
Well, you have, half the people in this country don't own the places they live in, so you really can't mount a bunch of speakers.
Yeah.
The Sennheiser bar, we were watching the Money Heist, and there's a scene in there where they got some machines running upstairs behind them, and we were sitting there, and I actually asked Anita if she had turned the dishwasher on, because it was literally coming from above us and behind us.
Yeah.
So I mean
that's great binaural
works. Implementation
right there.
And that works. And that is that's the digital stream, which is that's the the digital stream, which is encoded any way you want. It's not a binaural feed. It's actually multi-channel that's sent as a file.
That's multiplexed, yeah.
But when you go into your earphones, then it mixes all that down, and that's where the problems combine. And that's where, like Ronald Prent, what he does is he delivers a immersive mix, a 5-1 mix, and a binaural mix. That's what he delivers to everybody.
Interesting.
And he also delivers a stereo mix.
Uh-huh.
And because the console, the other thing that I did was because there's limited budgeting for this, they're only paying X amount of dollars, but they want all 3 formats.
Right.
My console is set up so it can do stereo simultaneously with immersive. So you just switch between the two, do a few touch-ups, and you got the stereo. So at the end of the day, you do the immersive one, and then you play it back, and you can and it's 16 channels and route that into 5.1, and then it's literally that simple to do. So you can create all the formats at one time and be done with it. Mm-hmm. But I mean, those are the challenges that happen, and when you're dealing with a Wild West type of situation, somebody has to make decisions.
Well, and that's funny right there, because you have really been sort of at the cusp of Wild West in almost every facet of this, from console development back in the early days of it, all the way to the Wild West we experience right now with immersive.
Right.
And each time, I think it's interesting to point out that at a certain point, somebody's just got to put their foot down and say, you know what, it's going to be this way. Because if you don't, the technology is not going to actually bear fruit.
And then what will happen is people start losing interest, they start getting frustrated, and then the format dies.
Yeah.
For music, realistically, 714 is great. And now, there's the debate of like wide left and right or side left and right. Well, my console can do one or the other. Mm-hmm. Like Ronald prefers to have the whole front as the band. Mm-hmm. So he has his 5.
Which makes sense.
Yeah. But other people want to have stuff in the side that are more control over. So that part of it, you can just move a patch cord and you've got it, But if they could just agree on that for music, because it's, you got people that are going, well, the console doesn't do the center channels upstairs. I said, well, you can use one of the stereo sends if you really want to do that, but try it without it. Do a 714 mix and see what you got.
Well, and there we get into the artistic decisions, especially the idea of, I had a conversation with Matt Wallace about this recently, because he had been remixing a bunch of stuff, including some B-52 stuff. And he said, he was remixing Love Shack. And he said, what was great about that was he was able to put the party back there, but the band up in front.
Which
and
it should be.
Exactly. And especially when you're dealing with existing material that people already know. People get pissed off because, we're remixing Marvin Gaye. I think to a certain extent, if the original was created a certain way, you got to be very careful with what you're redoing it, how you're redoing it.
There's a certain religious aspect to that.
Yeah.
Now,
Giles Martin.
Now, do you know what she says during the break of that song, where it stops, and then she says those 3 words and the band starts?
No, I've never been able to fathom that.
She says, tin roof, rusted.
Really?
Yeah.
I love it.
And she just
love it.
made it up right then. So that's what it is. It's actually tin roof, rusted.
Funny, because you can't hear that on the stereo mix.
It sounds like
sure.
she's saying something rest.
Yeah.
But she says tin roof, rusted.
Yeah, I thought it was Tim something. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. But I mean, you're right. But at the same time, you run that fine line of, am I supposed to stay in the box or should I move outside the box?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that killed Quad was the fact that the only records that came out were trains going around the room.
Right.
You don't want to get into that. You don't want to get into too much stuff. Originally, I think Dolby, in the early days of Atmos, Dolby wanted to do the mixing of the music themselves. And pretty much all of it got rejected because they were putting the snare over here and because they weren't mixing music.
Well,
they were mixing
again,
film.
they were coming at it from a different paradigm,
Right.
which is why I love the idea that we have people who understand mixing music, who understand the creative process of making music, because if you understand that, you're going to mix differently than if you're playing novelty,
Plus, you've got all this stuff has to be sent over the internet.
Well, there's that too.
So encoding and encryption and all that stuff, it presents a whole new list of problems.
Yeah.
So you can't have too much data, and using objects for everything creates a lot of phasing issues. So some of the guys are doing.
It's great for teaching.
Yeah, left, center, right. They're doing a discrete left, center, right because it's it's tied to those speakers.
Yeah.
You know, so there's certain things that you have to learn. I mean, everybody wants to use objects because they're so cool, but at the same time, every one of those objects is a three-dimensionally assigned phase position.
Yeah.
And if you assign reverb to that object, now you really have this complex waveform that you're moving around in space.
And it's going to interact with every other thing that's going on.
And then you're going to put that into headphones, which means it's all going to be combined to one. That creates a lot of weird things.
Well, and that is what I find annoying about some of these mixes, is that it gets really swimmy.
Yeah.
You know, everything's drifting everywhere, and there's no point of origin. And, you know, maybe that's great for gaming or for something like that, you know, some kind of effect. But when you're talking about music, you want a point of origin. It's just, it's the nature of the music.
It's really interesting. I helped in the early days of the Stephen Slate headphones, the room simulation, which his headphone system is just, it overshadows everybody. His sound's so real, because I've been in a lot of these rooms. And the way that he went around doing that, it creates the difference with headphones is you got your sound is there and there, but when you listen to it through the Slate headphones, you have the ambience.
You have
of the
a sphere.
You have you're in a room, okay. And I remember at his house when we were working on one thing of it, he had a person. We were just working on the placement of the microphones to record in, and there was a person in the room that walked behind me talking. And I heard it in the headphones as well. So it really does give you an immersive feeling. And the parallel between his headphones and the immersive mixes, basically what you're doing with objects is you're moving away from the speaker coming right into your ears, and you're using the ambience of the room. The two sound very, very similar.
As they should.
As they should. But it's interesting how it's really, the spatialization of both of them sound almost identical because of the space. You're not attached to the speaker, you're attached to the room. And so his stuff sounds, it's enjoyable to listen to. You can mix a record on those headphones, and it sounds better than if you were in a control room. I mean, it's just odd, but it works. But that's because you're not listening to the speaker, you're listening to the ambience of the speaker. And that's what immersive is doing, is it's putting you in a space, not in a room with speakers attached directly to the speakers of your ears. You know, you get left bleeds into right, right bleeds into left, you know, because it's in a room. You know, and that's kind of what that is supposed to create. So the two are very similar. I really enjoy listening to stuff through the Slate headphones. Before the immersive stuff started coming out, I found it more enjoyable to listen to because
puts a bit of air in the room in a way.
It puts you in a room with speakers. Is what it does. You feel like you're in a room. The cool thing about it is when you turn your head to adjust a compressor, you're still in the hot spot.
Which is, you know, actually that throws people off. You know, like with in-ear monitors on stage, that throws people off when the room moves with them.
Right.
You know,
and that's where you should have if you're going to have head tracking, you need a switch.
Exactly. That is it right there. You should be able to turn that on and off.
Yeah,
you know?
Because when you turn your head on stage, you want the position of the music to stay in your head turn. But when you're in the studio and you're adjusting stuff, I would rather
want to be in the sweet spot
wherever I'm going.
You want that sweet spot to follow you everywhere.
Now I can go stand by the patch bay and patch things and still be in that position. So that these are all the things that come up. Like you said, with standards, the beauty of standards is there's so many of them. You need to start developing things. And one of the things that I think hurt digital the most was nobody stepping up and fixing the reference level. Nobody knew what it was, because with a tape machine, +4 was your reference point. That was 0 VU, and then you basically had 20 to 24 dB above that with headroom. When they went from 16 bits to 24, the thing was 16 bits. If you recorded full level on 16 bits, it sounded fine, because 16 bits is enough. But to do a correct reference level, you're talking about doing 10 to 12 bits. Now you're getting right into that range of stuff where things are starting to sound a little bristly.
Yes.
So when they went to 24 bits, Now you're recording at 16.
You had that resolution that you needed. Yeah.
You're now recording at 16.
Yeah.
But so now the headroom, if you set it at 18, you basically have 18 dB of headroom, which is less headroom than you had with a tape machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you have a better noise floor. But that's the thing. If the meter had just said at minus 18, if it said 0, and then it went up 18 above that, I think this whole industry would be probably 3 years ahead of where it is.
We wouldn't be fighting those compression wars right now, that's
No.
for sure. Yeah.
And that's the other thing.
Yeah.
On a compressor, you have 0. And that's your reference point. Well,
Yeah.
wait a minute, but the meter, it's 0 all the way up here. That's actually plus 40, even on a compressor on a plug-in. Same with the, with the noise gate. The threshold is not 0; it's 0.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the two are always intertwined.
Different standards.
They're different standards,
Yeah.
but they should have just adapted that to be 0 and then above that.
Well, and there, you say they. There's where you get into the whole
That's the
Wild West thing.
problem. Who is
Yeah.
they?
Exactly.
It's
exactly.
that building.
It's us.
It's a building in Chicago where they come up with all the answers.
Okay.
The they people.
Okay, I didn't know it was in Chicago.
Yeah, it's a place in Chicago.
Thanks for narrowing that down.
Centrally located, and they say, well, there's a person there who said that, and that's who they are.
That's good to know. Thank you for narrowing that down. I always,
It's They Inc.
Okay.
They Incorporated.
Cool. So let's, because we can be here all day on this, but I want to wrap this in an intelligent way. And part of that is...
well, then we're going to talk about something else other than music then.
Fair point. Yeah,
Fair
okay,
point.
forget the intelligent part. But I want to wrap it in a sensible way. You had mentioned earlier about, going to Blackbird, and, Mark Rubel says to you, what do you advise students? Let's twist that a little bit. What do you advise somebody coming into the industry now in terms of, obviously a lot of the old rules still apply and will always apply. The rules of the creative process, the rules of
Not being the groove buster.
Knowing when to keep your mouth shut, understanding the whole artistry behind this. That's important. We know that. That's something that sometimes you can teach in class, sometimes you can't. So somebody coming into the industry now, there's so many different things to concentrate on. There's so many different possibilities. There's so many different jobs that, when you and I were entering the industry, you could be an engineer, you could hopefully be a producer if you really worked hard enough, but there were a limited number of avenues you could take. Now there's so many more.
There's so many more. Well, I think probably the main thing is being an engineer is not the best thing to get into. There's publishing, there's licensing, there's a lot of other aspects that really need people in there.
Yeah.
That are a lot better to get into. Even video editing. You go to Full Sail, you go to their audio thing, you'll never get a job as an audio engineer. You go to Full Sail and do their video thing, and you'll get a job at a radio station or a TV station almost immediately.
Well, and that's just it. That's a big part of it right there, I think, is that the industry itself has changed so much. If you're coming in now, you're almost overwhelmed with opportunities, possibilities. Right. The analogy there is we used to have 24 tracks to play with. That was it. You didn't have any more. Maybe you could lock a second machine to it, but you were taking chances there. You don't have, now you have as many tracks as you need. And the problem is you fill them all up. You don't have the
nice
bandwidth.
thing is you have as many tracks as you need. The problem is you have as many tracks as you need.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in a way, there's the analogy there of now you have so many different possibilities of directions you could go. If you're a young audio student or a young student coming into, let's even call it just media, multimedia. I hate that phrase because it's so misused. But
now it's infinite multimedia.
Exactly.
The media is infinitely.
Right. But you walk into, you decide, I want to be in this industry. You go to Blackbird, you go to, Full Sail, you go to Crass, wherever. Again, things that we didn't have the opportunity to take advantage of. how do you even know what the hell you want to do?
Well, you have to. One of the things that you have to do, and this is again the basis of life. This is nothing that is new or old. You have the things that you want, the things that you wish or want to do, and then there's the things that you're good at.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, of course, you want the glamour of the rock and roll business, but maybe you're better. I mean, are your financial books in order? Are your books like dead on? Do you understand money? Do you understand financing? Do you understand your tax returns? You got all that down pat. Okay, you know what? Get into the rock and roll business, but be the guy that does the licensing. Be the guy that does the royalties. Work for ASCAP or BMI. Look at that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Understand publishing.
And get into like getting laws passed. Get into being an advocate for musicians' rights at the same time. Or be a production an editor. Because editing is something. If you're really meticulous about stuff, maybe doing the guy holding the camera may not be the job for you. Maybe the guy editing all that stuff is the thing, and then you get into film editing, that type of thing, composition, all those different aspects. The engineer, he seems to be the coolest guy, but he's a conduit.
Yeah.
And to do that, you have to understand that you're not just a recorder. The first thing you want to do is not get in the way of the artist, but at the same time, you have to guide the artist.
You have to support the
away
artist
from the mouse hole.
Yeah.
Because he can go down a mouse hole and it'll be never ending. So you've got to know when to direct him out of that without killing the groove. You don't want to spend all day fucking around with all the knobs because the guy's going to be like, and then the whole mode is gone.
Groove buster.
Yeah, and that's a guy you don't want to be.
Well,
you want to open your mouth when you're asked early on.
Yeah.
When you finally become of authority, then people will take your advice. That's the biggest problem with even designing stuff. I can design something and there'll be 50 people that want to play with it immediately. When I first started out, I couldn't get arrested because I have no track record. Who the hell are you? People know now that I can hear things. People know now that I can design things. So when I say, hey, I've got a new EQ, people want to try it out. So it takes time to develop that. You don't just walk into that kind of stuff. And the same with an engineer. You're not going to be like a hit maker. Now, there is that time, like, when Tom Fly got his start in recording, he was the assistant engineer on American Pie. Now, their engineer got sick or had to do something or had to go somewhere or something like that, but they had to get that mix in. So he did the mix. And
like
it
we
became
said,
a hit.
That's what happens, right?
And that's the launch. So you've got to be able to grab that opportunity and always be ready for it. And it may take years to come. And then when that happens, nobody wants to use you now because they don't want to sound like him. So then you have to do a second one that's in a different area. And then all of a sudden, you're the guy.
But the doors open, and as the doors open, you got to be there for them.
You got to grab opportunity.
And that's universal, that's as universal now as it was 50 years ago.
Well, my other analogy that I tell people is the future is a train, and it's moving at 40 miles an hour. Now, there's certain things that are traditional about the train. The tracks, the wheels, the engine, stuff like that. Those are things you can't change. But that train is moving at 40 miles an hour. When it comes through your town, you have two choices. Get on the train or wave goodbye as it goes by. Because it's not going to stop. It's not going to wait. It's going to move no matter what. And it may be moving in a direction that you don't like, so you go, I'm not getting on that train. What I prefer to do is get on the train and then drive the train. Because you can't steer the future unless you get involved in it. And that's what I try to do, as I try to get involved in it and try to steer it in a more sensible direction. And those are that is opportunity. And then there's the things that you know, there's the things that you don't know, but there are things that you don't know that you don't know.
Yes.
Those are the things that are true opportunities. That's opening a door into a dark room. Is there a floor there? I don't know, but you know what? I'm going to step in and see. Or you can wait till someone else does it, and then they're first. Maybe being second is better. A
lot of times it is.
A lot of times it is, because if there isn't a floor, that guy's dead and you're not. But those are the opportunities that are there. But the thing is, you don't want to distract from the forward motion. But when you start to see holes in the forward motion, then you can correct those. And maybe your sessions go smoother because of those. And the guy likes working with you better than the old guy, because you don't waste time on these certain things because you understand more about how that equipment works. So if you have time in a studio, don't just sit there and talk to your friends on the phone and say, hey, I'm in the studio. Pick a piece of equipment and go through it like nobody's
How do I
business.
use this thing? Yeah.
How does the threshold work? I had a world famous mastering engineer come to me at a trade show one time. And she came up to me and she said, could you give me a couple of minutes? And I said, sure. So we walked over to a quiet area and she said, can you explain to me how a compressor works? I've been mastering for years and my stuff sounds really good and I always adjust it. I know that I move certain knobs and do certain things. So we went down the line and she said, you know what, that's what I thought, but I wasn't sure.
Well, and a lot of that comes from being self-taught.
Right.
You know, a lot of that comes from us figuring out how something works without necessarily knowing the terminology or knowing that, you know, we just know that I did this and it worked, you know. And there have been so many times in my life, and I'm sure the same is true for you, where I've learned something and then maybe a month later, 6 months later, even years later, I find out, oh shit, I've been doing that right.
Yeah.
You know?
You find
because
out you've been doing it right.
you compare notes with someone
or someone
finally.
says, hey, did you know that if you pull the knob out and you didn't even know it pulled
Exactly.
out?
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
like on a guitar, there's a pickup thing, series parallel.
Oh,
or
it's
something.
happened to me. Yeah.
Yeah, but those are the types of things, and that's where the second thing I always say is pay attention.
Yes.
And my example is if you're standing at the end of the console and somebody walks around you to do something and you move out of the way, okay, do you move back to where you were because you're going to be in the way again, or do you go somewhere else where you're out of the way permanently? A lot of people who just move back where they were. So I moved out of the guy's way. I wasn't in his way. But you were because he came towards you and you moved. So don't ever go back there again. Go over here. Mm-hmm. That's part of observation.
Yeah.
If you know that the knob is going to
perspective.
distort when you turn it up all the way, don't turn it up all the way the next time. Go halfway up and then see.
Yeah.
Because you know it's going to distort. Always remember that. And if you paid attention, you would remember that.
It's like learning to drive a car. Especially, you know, the first time if you learn to drive a stick shift, for example, you know.
It never leaves you.
Exactly. But you also learn that, okay, if I just press down on this and let go of that, it's going to stall. I have to do this gradually. I have to proportion things,
Feathering.
you know. Yes.
Gentle.
Ooh, I love it.
Gentle
Yeah.
is. Yeah, I mean, that's the same with a console when you're balancing things. You know?
Yeah.
Like when I work with Jimmy, I had him draw me out on a chart. I said, you know, there's some things where I put your vocal higher and the harmony is behind you. And there's some things when I do you all the same. Mm-hmm. And he was like, "Oh, that's interesting because that's how that's how it should be.
That's how I hear it."
Yeah. And he, you know, so we went down each song, and he told me what his preferences were, and I drew a peak where it was him, and I drew a line where it was balanced.
Uh-huh.
And so when I do the band, there's certain things where he's telling the story, and these guys are just backing him up.
Right.
And there's certain times when they're singing.
When it's a choir. Yeah.
And those are the types of things that, you know, you learn.
Yeah.
And then you might want to ask the artist when you're in the studio, say, now, when we're doing these balancing of the harmonies, do you want to be your voice up front and then behind you, or do you want them all the same? Well, the chorus, I want them the same, but the verses, I want mine, you know.
Right, which is a subset of the whole idea of just learning the artist, learning the song.
Right.
You know, I always talked about how if I'm working with an artist, I talk to them about where'd this song come from. You know, what were you thinking when you wrote this song? Because a lot of times that will give you a different gleaning of how to create the song.
Plus, the artist, when he sees you interested in it, it makes him feel better.
Yes.
So he's
and
going to
they'll open up to you.
better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you ask the guy, he's going like, oh, wow, this guy's really interested in this. So now I can really get artistic and really fine-tune it the way I envisioned it. Because a lot of artists just figure the engineer's going to just glaze over certain things.
Or they figure the engineer's just going to read their mind.
Right.
That happens a lot too.
Right. And there's no problem in asking one of the things I learned from Jimmy is don't like say that was good, let's do a better one. Just say, hey, let's keep recording. Let's do like 5 of these.
Let's do another one.
Sit down and pick the one. Because if you tell him that the one he just did wasn't any good, that just tells him, does the whole thing suck? Was there one part that sucked? Was there, you know?
Yeah.
So now he's thinking about, oh my God, I got to change everything.
I have always phrased it. One thing I learned early on was I don't say, you know, let's do a better one or anything like that. I say, that was good. You want to do another one?
Right.
You know, and that gives them the option, and it does not flavor their opinion of the last
Right.
one at all, you know.
Or nice, let's double that.
Yeah, there you go. Something like that, you know.
Then one of the other things I do with doubling is a lot of times I'll send the double to the reverb, and I won't put it in the mix.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I'll have the primary one in the mix, so the double is
Yeah.
a little off pitch from the mix, and it sounds fat.
Actually, I learned that over the shoulder of Phil Ramone,
Yeah.
because Phil used to do that a lot, and I remember watching him on a session doing that and think, ooh, that's clever, because your reverb is just slightly different, you know.
Yeah.
Not enough to, especially if you've got a great vocalist, you
Right.
know. There are some vocalists out there who can literally just double the same thing without even hearing it again.
I had
you
one
know?
that could do it so accurately it would flange.
Yeah.
But then you got ones that can't.
yes.
And
yes.
the ones that can't are the cool ones because that's what you put in the reverb.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but those are all those little tricks that you pay attention. And it's like looking at Al Schmidt mic something. Look at the pictures of Al Schmidt miking a microphone.
Yeah, yeah.
Why is he crouched down looking at exactly perpendicular to the mic? Well, you know,
Because he wants to hear what the mic's hearing.
he's also taking,
Yeah.
he might be using a figure 8 pattern on that mic, and he's nulling it to the cymbal. And it's picking up the drum, picking up the room, which doesn't matter, but it's nulling out the signal. And so he's really concentrating. Don't look at Al Schmidt setting up the microphone. The picture of him setting up the mic, oh, that's really cool. Look where his eyes are looking. Look at the microphone's position against that. That's where the information is. Yeah, it's cool to see him do that because he was a god doing that. But there's a reason that he did that. And there's a reason he could set up a set of mics and he's ready to record and you're still fucking around moving the mics around. You know?
Yeah.
And I mean, he looks at the distance between all the mics, and he knows that certain mics, like the overheads, always pointing at the snare, and your room mics always pointing at the snare. You know, those types of things. Those are the little things that aren't spelled out. But watch what the person does. If you have a mentor, watch how he does things, because don't look at him. Look at what he's doing.
Yeah.
Because that's where the information lies.
Yeah.
You know, that's where it doesn't matter how you record, what medium you record on, what you're recording through, or whatever. Miking that instrument has certain things that are fact.
Yes.
If you don't do them correctly, they're not going to sound good. And that's what a lot of kids do. One of the problems at Sunset they run into is that they have the guys will come in to do drum sessions, and they'll write out every mic in the studio, and they'll run 24 to 32 channels of mics.
when you really only needed 4.
Because they don't know where to place them, so
Yeah.
they're just basically archiving the drum kit, and then
That's it exactly. There's a mic on every drum.
or two,
Yeah, or two,
overheads
yeah.
here, and here,
And
near
3
kit,
pairs of
close
room
kit,
mics.
yeah,
and,
up snare, the bottom snare, side snare,
Yeah.
you know,
yeah.
all these different things because they don't really know.
And ultimately, that's only going to create, again, more confusion.
Phasing issues.
The paralysis of analysis, you know, which one do I use? That is so, again, just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. Yeah.
I mean, there's features that that people use because they're there.
Yeah.
Don't use them. You know, make it simple, and that's where it all comes back to the simple console.
Make it simple.
You know?
Yeah.
And with consoles nowadays, you know, I sold a lot of 16-channel consoles. I sold one 8-channel console to a guy in Australia, 8 channels in a master section, and he recorded his whole studio. Everything he does, he makes records. He's got a blog every day. He puts up who he's recording in the studio with 8 channels. Now the 8 channels has a tilt style EQ on it. It has a high and low pass sweep filter. Plus it has 3 inputs per channel, so you can sum in 3 per channel. So you can sum back when you're mixing 24 inputs into that console. And then go through the master section, which has the 3 stereos that can sound like 3 different consoles. So he has a lot of flexibility, but it's just with 8 channels. Terry Lewis and Jimmy Jam, they have a 16-channel one. Ronald Prent has 64 because he wants to run 48 channels, and then he wants to do 16 of a fold down. Greg Wells has 48 because that's how many tracks he's going to use. He does the fold down differently. You know, so everybody has that thing. You know, but I've got just as many 16s as I have 48s out there. So
Well, I love the simplicity approach. I think that really does make sense. And again, you know, you go back to somebody like Al Schmidt, you know, who could record an entire orchestra with 1 microphone.
right.
You know, that I think there's a beauty in learning the simplicity first, because it really does force you to think of other aspects.
And that's agonizing when you're there, because you really want to move beyond that.
Yeah.
But it's like in electronics. You've got to know Ohm's law before you know everything else.
You've got to know the basics, yeah.
It's got to frustrating as hell.
Yeah.
But you have to.
Well, and to go back to your original point, you start out in the box, whatever that box is. You have to learn the parameters of that box before you can step outside those
Right.
parameters.
Yeah.
And then, yes, as you say, you're going to build another box, but always pushing those parameters is really, really great if you understand the principles behind them.
Pushing the limits.
Yeah.
That's why they have test pilots. Test pilots don't take off and land. They do stuff where they go straight up and down and stall, and then they see if they can get out of it.
Yeah.
Those types of things. They're they're pushing the limits. You
Yeah.
know? And you never know. You might find a new feature of something, a feature that no one ever realized was there. And that's innovation.
Yeah.
That's where you innovate, and that may be your signature.
But that is, again, by pushing the limits, by saying, what if I do this?
Yeah.
What if I take this thing that's made for that and use it for something completely different?
But the thing is knowing when to do that.
Right.
And not be the groove buster.
Yeah.
See, that's
yeah.
part of the procedural learning, as well as the technical learning. Is
Yeah.
you have to learn when not to do something like that. Like if everything's rolling in the studio, don't start noodling around.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Well, don't be the engineer when you need to be the tape op.
Right.
Basically, don't be the nerdy person when the nerdy opportunity is not there.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
can do that when you're mixing all you want.
Yeah, yeah.
When you're tracking that, when that guy's in a groove, it's like there was a James Brown session at Green Street Studios, and I had stopped by there a couple days afterwards, and they said, "Yeah, we just had James Brown. He was doing Living in America," and we
Oh.
set up a red light and then blue light to shine on the microphone, so we got a little bit of an atmosphere, But he disappeared. We couldn't find him. We were ready to record, and we couldn't find him. We went around to all the restaurants, all the bars, everywhere. Couldn't find him anywhere. And Green Street Studios had this little teeny bathroom. Okay, so they're looking everywhere. Can't find the guy. 2 hours later, he comes walking out of the bathroom, and he's got his hair is done up. He's got his whole, American flag uniform on with the tail that comes out the back, makeup, the whole bit. And he comes out and he says, "I'm ready." And he was ready to go. And he went in there and he had the outfit on, he had the lights on him. He was in that zone. And
Yeah.
the last thing you want to do is say, "Well, hang on a second, let me patch the mic in." You patch that mic
better be ready.
You patch it into 3 mic pre's. You take the output of that mic pre, you patch it into 3 different compressors, you patch it into 3 different EQs, and you record 6 tracks of his vocal, and you go.
Yep.
You
yep.
know?
And you figure it out later.
Frank Sinatra did a session with Alan Sides one time where he came in, they had a whole orchestra set up. He comes in, he goes, and the orchestra starts, he starts singing, 3/4 of the way through, he stops. He says, "Let's go back 16 bars and start from this point." So he goes, the band starts up again. He goes, "Great," and leaves. So they've got 3/4 of a
pieces.
song and 3/4 of a song, and that's it. The tempo was exact. The guy was not a slouch in the studio.
Oh, yeah. yeah.
Tempo was exact, and Alan had to splice the tracks together and make it one contiguous thing. And he said it was phenomenal when he was done. You got to be ready to do that.
Yeah.
And this, his vocal mic did not go into one channel onto a piece of tape. That thing went through a mic pre, and then it went through one compressor sent one way, one another way, one straight on 4 different tracks or whatever, because one of them might be wrong and the other one might be right, and you don't have time to go back and redo it.
Yeah.
So there you go. My life in a nutshell.
That's good, because I was trying to figure out how the hell do we even wrap this, because we could be here all day.
Well, this is
talking
why the
this,
Sunset Sound thing was 2.5 hours.
I love that.
And I got so many texts from people that said, "I watched the whole thing."
Yeah. Well, and that's just it, because we can keep going back and forth, because so much of this is so intertwined, and that's what I love about this industry, is the fact that so much of the technical and the creative are intertwined, and we really, we're doing this to support the creation of art.
We're also trying to wrap 40 years of experience in 2 hours.
Yeah, yeah.
But hopefully it's a slap in the face to someone that says, look, it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Well, but you just pointed out something, and there's a panel that I do every year at NAMM talking about the production process, and it has nothing to do with any of the technical stuff. It's capturing that lightning in a bottle.
Right.
It's just saying, you know what, I'm ready because I have been training for this moment for so long, and then I have captured that magic.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing, man. That's what we're here for.
No, and that's it turns out when you hear a record that just blows you away. I think I believe the Living in America, I think they recorded that entire album of vocals with 1 or 2 takes.
I would not be surprised.
Because he was warmed up.
Yeah, yeah. And again, there you're talking about somebody who, as an artist, can seize the moment.
Yeah.
Just, I'm ready,
if he's
here I
willing
am.
to do that, if he's willing, and there's a lot of people that say, why do we have to set these lights up? It's like, this record could make him $1 million. If he wants a fucking red light shining on his face,
Hey, whatever.
Bring
it.
I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be the guy that says no. And the engineer, when you see that guy going through what he's willing to do to get that right, are you willing to do the same thing? Mm-hmm. I would dress up just like him, just to make it seem like it was a fun thing. It's like, oh my God, look, he's dressed up like I am. This is going to be fun.
Yeah. Or you get a crowd, whatever whatever it takes to bring out that performance. I think that's what we're there for.
Right.
And that's that has been the thing. That has been my mantra for so long now. The idea that whatever that person who's in front of that microphone, or those artists who are in front of that microphone, our job is to be there for them and to get the best performance out of them.
120%.
I don't care. I don't care whether you're the tape op, whether you're the producer, whether you're the guy holding the spotlight at a show. Whatever it is, we are there to support that artist and get that memorable performance out of them. That's the whole gig.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if the guy looks down and sees the spotlight going like this, does he think that he's dizzy? Does he think that the spotlight guy's falling asleep, and all of a sudden he just broke his concentration?
Yeah.
Little things like that. I mean, but that is the difference. There's the 10,000 bands all trying to do the same thing. Why does only one of them get signed?
Yeah.
It's because they refined all those things.
And they were able to get into the zone and create that magic.
Yeah.
And if they're creating that magic, man, we got to be there for them.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
That's your job. Your job is not to be, like some great guy. You got to be there. You got to be the humble. When I did Woodstock '94 with the record plant truck, okay, I went there as the technical advisor. If something broke, it was up to me to fix it. And you're live. They spent $28 million on the broadcast for that, okay? You don't want to be the guy that takes them offline.
Yeah.
We actually had it happen. We lost time code right before we went live.
Oops.
And I was the one that figured out what was wrong, okay? But all the trucks lost time code right 2 minutes before showtime.
Oh.
But when we pull up, the first thing that I did, because the other guys were doing other things, is I made the coffee. I started making coffee because I had nothing to do until something broke. I'm not just going to sit there. So whatever it took, and that's the thing. You do whatever it takes to get to that moment, then you capture that.
Yep. Yep.
Groovy.
Cool. Paul Wolff, thank you for being my guest.
That's who I am.
Yes, it is. I think I introduced you at the beginning, didn't I?
Who is this guy?
Yeah, who is this guy anyway? Hey, I'm Daniel Keller. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us each week for Insights in Sound.